I kind of want to give a bit of a general breakdown on what exactly we're going to talk about, a little bit of context. So within major cities, I know we think of a lot of places like Chicago as being very dangerous and crime ridden, but really what it comes down to is a very small portion of the city with just certain neighborhoods, and even you can narrow down to particular streets with disinvested areas. And of course, business and real estate in those communities will be stagnant and people won't want to construct there because they know it's dangerous to build there. So a lot of times there will be certain areas, and they might even be close by, but you'll definitely see the switch from a heavily invested in area and one without grocery stores, without other resources for people, vacant lots. So what a lot of new thinking about this topic has led to is something called place-based investing. And so what place-based investing actually is similar to what we were talking about with ESG investing, where people want to put their money into places that will both give them high financial returns, but also will make you feel good inside and make you feel like you're spending your money ethically. This is just investing into those disenfranchised areas and marginalized communities and helping them build up the value of the real estate and business within there. So there's a couple of different funds and organizations that are collaborating to work on this. One in particular is the Western New York Impact Investment Fund. And so this is about $8 million that they've gathered, a pool of money, and they're going to seek to invest in projects in Western New York and try to build back up the area. So it's definitely something interesting, and it connects back to what we've already talked about.
I think the issue with these funds is that nobody wants to take the risk of placing their money into an area that has such a high crime rate. Because business within itself is risky enough, and then you don't want to place your assets under that kind of fire. But I sort of want to outline the structure of. We'll take you through a few different cities in New York, including New York across the United States, like David mentioned. I know in New York specifically, we're New Yorkers, and we've heard a lot about crime spikes. Historically speaking, New York is actually in a better place than most people think in terms of violent crimes, stuff like that. We haven't, compared to 1990 and even like just 10 years ago, we're in a much better place. Obviously, there was a spike during COVID, like many other cities saw.
Yeah.
But right now, what we're seeing a lot of is sort of like petty thefts, robberies, vehicles without plates, illegal dirt bikes. There were some illegal weapons that were confiscated. So Eric Adams is very like crime forward. He's focused.
Former cop.
Yes, exactly. Which is why he's very focused on police presence in subways, on streets.
Yeah.
I think it's had a very positive impact. The only thing is the district attorney in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg. He operates sort of separately from the mayor.
Yeah.
He's a lot more lenient with these policies in terms of letting people out even after they've been arrested.
Exactly. And during, I think it was Mayor Giuliani, we had that, I think it's called the broken glass policy or something, where they were very comfortable with even petty crimes, nipping it at the bud and stopping things from spreading from there, because what you get is a lot of repeat offenders and juvenile gangs, and that's where things kind of branch off from. But New York is definitely taking steps to build up investment into these, communities of disenfranchised people. A new trend that's going on in New York is in a lot of the new condo buildings and expensive luxury type buildings that you see, the first few floors are actually reserved for affordable housing to make sure to not uproot a whole community and kick everyone out once they start new construction.
What's interesting is I know there was a loophole. So we have Billionaires Row on West 57th Street in the city.
Right.
Those buildings were required to include affordable housing on the lower floors. What they did was they found some sort of gray area where they could build that affordable housing off-site. So they did build the required amount of affordable housing units, but they built them in, I think, another area closer to the Bronx.
Right.
And it counted for that project. So the full project is full of multi-million-dollar units. But what's interesting, I want to pivot to Chicago for a second. Chicago's a completely different story. So what we see in Chicago is obviously we have these concentrated hotspots, but we also have a lot of armed robberies in the city center. A lot more than we see in the city. There was this 80% spike in homicides since 2019. And the issue is where a lot of other cities sort of saw an increase in crime during COVID, and then maybe it tapered off. They had some initiatives. Chicago really hasn't been doing amazing, even since COVID. They've had a huge history of crime since the Haymarket crisis.
Yeah.
And obviously there's the West and South Side that are infamous.
Yes. So that's what everyone thinks about when they think of crime in Chicago. Those are a lot of the notorious areas. 63rd is a street that we hear about a lot in pop culture. So clearly there's a lot of problems going on in Chicago, but I wouldn't say that necessarily represents Chicago from a business perspective, because there are those areas that are more city-like and definitely have a ton of company headquarters there.
But look, we had Ken Griffin from Citadel move his headquarters to Miami because of concerns of violent crime. Mm-hmm. But what worries me more is that Mayor Lightfoot has a very different approach to Eric Adams in New York. So what she wants to do is, there's a lot of vacant lots in the south side.
Yes.
And for some reason, what she thinks, like as part of her recovery plan, is that if she sells those lots and builds affordable housing, that's going to aid with crime, and then to use those funds to bring investment to the area. But I think it's sort of a backwards way of looking at it. You can't. I think the first thing that you should do is bring in more policing to make the area safer,
right?
And then you encourage investment. You can't just pour money into an area without repercussions for the crime that's occurring in the area.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of put a Band-Aid over a problem like this and expect it to work, but it's not a novel idea to renovate a lot of those abandoned and empty lots and put in more infrastructure for people to use. And that has been shown to have a really positive impact on communities. And it's interesting, this is kind of doubling down on a policy that Chicago had back in 2014, the large lots program, where they offloaded about 1,500 plots to residents, block clubs, nonprofits for just $1 each, just empty land that they were giving out and hoping that...
Just to encourage development.
Yes, exactly. Hoping that people would use that to build up these communities.
But this kind of creates a chicken or the egg situation. Mm-hmm. Are there less banking options, grocery options, infrastructure, less options because of the crime there? Or is there increased crime because there's few options? And I think it's difficult to answer that question because this stuff has been going on for so long that it's difficult to point to where the flip was,
Right, and it's almost like a vicious cycle. I mean, it's definitely going to be hard to figure out which one came first. I mean, maybe you could track it back tons of years. But of course, from a business perspective, if you're even looking right now, for example, to start a new small business, of course, you're not going to want to build in areas where your property is probably going to get vandalized or robbed. Like you were talking about, an 80% increase since 2019. If you're looking
at homicides, nonetheless, not even in small crimes.
So of course, you're going to want to pick the safer area with the Citadel headquarters, which, as we just mentioned, maybe we can piggyback into what Miami is doing and Mayor DeSantis. How has he been handling crime?
DeSantis is a completely separate approach. Before we jump into that, I want to touch on really quickly, like you said, if you're opening a small business in Chicago or any other city, you're going to go for the safer area just because there's enough risk involved with business. But the way to make those more dangerous areas more viable option for business is, I think, increased police presence, because if you see cops in the street, your business is going to be inherently more protected from the risk of the crime. You know what I mean?
True. If you have police on standby watching over these businesses to make sure nothing happens, then it would definitely decrease crime rate. But again, there's another scenario with the defund the police movement, which I'm sure is occurring in Chicago and a lot of other big cities where this is clearly not the route that they want to take.
Exactly. And I mean, the media plays a huge role in, I guess, where people's opinions lie nowadays, just because it's easier to pitch that information. But so you mentioned Miami.
Yes.
Miami is doing great. Compared to Chicago and New York, they're at a 4-decade crime low.
Yep.
There are disparities, like we mentioned, in areas, like, for example, between Model City and Coconut Grove. Model City is a lower-income area. Coconut Grove is a much richer area. It was home to, a ton of celebrities, basketball players, actresses, stuff like that. There's a huge difference in crime. Sometimes it's sevenfold between the two neighborhoods. But overall, Miami is considered a far safer place. And when we're looking at real estate investing and other corporate investments, Miami's more of a tax haven than the other states that we just mentioned because of the lack of estate tax.
Exactly. And it's interesting, just to even circle back to what we were talking about with Chicago, where it was, 80% increase in homicide. If you look at the trends going on, even in Miami in particular, in the past, it was looked at kind of like as a drug haven and a ton of cocaine smuggling, things like that. But when you're just looking at trends, clearly there's been a downward trajectory. And with that comes movement from big businesses, just such as Citadel.
Not just Citadel, a ton of different tech companies banks are moving to Miami, and even Formula One recently opened up a track in Miami, which is it's the third. It's not the third. It was the second, and they're opening a third. All Formula One tracks are in states with no state tax, and that are Republican states, which I think is pretty funny. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but there's Texas, Florida, and they're opening one in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Interesting, yeah. So with Ken Griffin, who's actually the what is he? Oh, billionaire who owns Citadel, I believe.
He bought a penthouse.
He moved the headquarters to Miami from Chicago. He was directly responsible. I'm just going to tell you the contrast between what's the policy is like in Chicago with where you mentioned they should probably be increasing police presence in a lot of these areas. Griffin himself is starting an initiative and he's donating a ton of money in the order of about $55-60 million to improving policing and reducing crime in Miami. Wow. He tried something similar in Chicago, and now he's doing it here. So it's interesting. I mean, clearly we can see what works and what doesn't in both of these areas. Yeah.
Right. And I guess let's go to Houston. And it's difficult to look at Houston without considering the entirety of Texas, just because the policies are so similar from state to state. So they have seen a decrease in violent crime since COVID. The mayor did create a $73 million fund.
One Safe Houston.
Yes, that's the one. Just to help with crime. And again, there's no state tax. There's no zoning laws, so businesses are free to develop. And there was a huge exodus from California to
Texas and even
Texas in general.
Well.
So there's a lot of tech companies in Austin, Houston, the Dallas area. It's just huge hubs.
Another area with no state or corporate income tax.
Yes.
So that's clearly the trend that we're looking at here. And it's interesting. I mean, even just to circle back to the One Safe Houston initiative that you brought up, a lot of what they're doing comes back to nipping the crime in the bud and starting with the youth. So what they're doing, it's not just violence reduction, it's also prevention, like stopping it before it even happens, intervening during the youth stages, providing those outreach opportunities, carving a space within communities to make sure that people are growing up without the juvenile gangs taking over.
Honestly, that's amazing stuff. And I think that when you really bring it back to the root, these things, like when you look at crime in general, and there have been studies that show that when you provide better education opportunities in these areas with higher crime, as adults, they have better outcomes, because there's different things present in our lives. There's, more investment in those areas. So it's not just investment, but it's targeting it, like you said, to youth in schools. It does take time for that to reflect, but ultimately when you start at the ground level,
we're looking long term.
Exactly. It's much, much more effective.
And we talked about the innovation district with all the new startups, and even just to bring up the chicken and the egg example again, this is a pretty new area with the corporations, VC, everything going on in there. But now that's about a crime rate of 60% lower than the Houston average in that specific space.
I want to touch on that.
What came first here?
It's a complete contrast to other cities. So obviously we know that there's huge investment, but if you're a state like Texas, you want to protect all the companies that are coming in. You don't want an influx of crime to scare those companies away.
Exactly.
After all, they have like 50 of the Fortune 100 global headquarters centered in Texas. I want to take you guys back to New York just for a second. New York's Midtown, which is a financial hub. We have JP Morgan, we have BlackRock, we have a ton of hedge funds.
A ton, obviously.
Highest crime rate in the city. Chicago, their downtown area, another one of the highest crime rates. Los Angeles, downtown, highest crime rates. Even in Miami, their downtown area has higher crime rates. Houston, complete opposite situation. It's the absolute inverse. It's the safest area, which makes the most sense because this little stretch of lands, the Ion District, is effectively like a tiny Silicon Valley. So I think it's amazing that they're protecting and they're really they're creating this little sphere for all those minds to collaborate without those distractions.
Of course. I mean, as a city, you obviously will want to invest deeply into the infrastructure of the communities that are bringing in the most money, the most eyeballs, making your state as great as it can possibly be. So I love the investment into the Ion District. I think it's an example that should set a precedent for other states to follow suit. And a lot of it, I do think, comes down to who's managing each of these cities. who's in charge, what kinds of policies are they putting into place. I definitely see the value of what they're doing in relation to youth development, and especially, just keeping cities safer through police as well. I don't think that's something that we should shy away from, the way that the trends are looking right now.
And there's another issue that we haven't touched on. When we speak about Los Angeles and California in general, so we're going to throw San Francisco into that general bin. What the issue that they're seeing there is a homeless population.
Yeah. So Skid Row is one we could probably throw up a visual. Infamous. Just tons and tons of people, all homeless. Tons of drugs problems there, and it hasn't been addressed for years.
So here's what's interesting. Crime in Los Angeles has dropped 10%.
Mm-hmm.
I have to check relative
over
to
the
what
past
year. Yes, but overall, it's on a decline. So, like I was saying, California is 12% of the nation's population. They're home to 30% of the homeless population. Another crazy number. Low income bracket is $117,000 for a family of four in San Francisco. So, like you were saying, with drugs and this homeless environment that's created, it's not so much the policing and the crime, but it's a lot more of, for example, restrictive government, which is why Elon Musk moved his headquarters to Texas, and the homeless population, that it doesn't create an amazing business environment.
It absolutely doesn't. And what you were actually bringing up with Texas, with the Ion District, where businesses feel comfortable living there, it's one of the safest parts in the city. The founder of Cash App, Bob Lee, who you think he has tons of resources, tons of money, like a billionaire, he just died in a stabbing attack in April in San Francisco.
Wow.
Just like that, a super wealthy person. But again, you need to protect the business owners. You need to make people feel comfortable keeping their headquarters there. You don't want people to feel scared to live in an area where they're setting up shop.
Well, I mean, the goal is to protect everyone,
of course,
not just the business owners. And I think that,
but my point being, somebody with all of that money and all that resources,
it doesn't matter.
It's not safe. Exactly.
But also, I think that we should say that the issue is not necessarily the homelessness, but it's everything that comes before that. Like the things that lead up to it. So, for example, extremely high housing costs. Probably a lack of policing that allows these drugs to flow into the state, and stuff like that. So it's just this huge cycle of, unfortunately, housing costs are too expensive. People can't afford it. There's not much being done about the issue of homelessness, and all of that creates just unfavorable conditions and dangerous.
Right.
Like we said.
And in Los Angeles in particular, what city was it where you were giving the contrast between the super expensive areas and the more disinvested?
That was in Miami.
In Miami. Here it's a similar idea. You think of areas Westwood, Santa Monica, but then of course there are also famous areas Compton and South LA where it's pretty dangerous out there. And you see a huge difference in the incarceration rates. In the super wealthy areas, it's close to 0%. In the areas that are more segregated, it's about 7%.
It's an unbelievable contrast. And I think just as we were doing our research, it's probably the greatest contrast of any city, specifically in Los Angeles. There's such isolated areas.
Exactly. And it comes down to even what I was talking about in the beginning. You can look at these specific streets, like this is where things build from. But it's clear actually that LA is trying to take the lead from other states that are increasing their spending in police, similar to Texas. They're planning on hiring about hundreds of more officers and expanding their police force even further. So I hope that can create a safer environment for everybody and address a lot of the root issues.
I'm still shocked how Houston, their downtown area, is the safest, compared to the rest of the city. And it's the opposite in every other city in Europe, every other major city in America. But before we sort of wrap up here, because we're running a little bit short on time, Detroit, I want to speak about briefly. They had a booming, it was called the Motor City.
Yeah.
A ton of factory jobs, management jobs, stuff like that. And all of a sudden, everything fell apart. Manufacturing was offshore, investment moved out of the city, and crime became rampant. So there we saw an example. It sort of answers the chicken and egg question. You don't invest, and then crime becomes rampant. But then once crime becomes rampant, how can you now reinvest?
Exactly. I mean, that's an area that I think it's going to probably take years from now until it's back to what it used to be. And another area we can look to is St. Louis.
Right.
Another super dangerous city, completely changed its reputation.
The most dangerous city.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Completely changed its reputation over the past few years. I'm just hoping that we again come back to what we know works, which is increasing police presence, but also addressing crime at the root. And over time, I think investment should come back, and we'll get into a good cycle there with both of those cities.
Beautiful.
But thank you everybody for watching. This is going to wrap up our episode today. I hope everybody got something out of it. It was a lot of fun for us to research this. A lot of new information that I wasn't even familiar with before.
Exactly. If you guys are friends with any governors or politicians, please feel free to show them this overview.
We'll start up a consulting gig. We'll go city by city.
All right. Over and out, guys.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Good talk.
That was packed with information.
My dad will probably like this.
This one?
Yeah.